start. So to start out, we just wanted to ask each speaker what you've heard from other speakers. Is there one thing that stands out, and why? So I guess we'll start maybe with Paul.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rebecca. I thought all of them were very thought-provoking and interesting, and I do think the common theme here is that we're overdue for modernizing our grid. We have to get this in place. Right? There's some silent hand claps there. And I think the idea, I mean, the thing that strikes fear into me, I was mentioning as Dennis presented, I don't know if you caught the bottom line there, that Sharon standard for medium and heavy duty charging is 1 megawatt per connector per vehicle. Just imagine 20 trucks pulling up to one spot and asking for 20 megawatts. So that's the kind of change that is coming very quickly, and we have to figure out how to do that. And I do think that the idea that Lyle, you shared about let's use everything possible together, like reactive power, and put that in place, and have the utilities be able to actually access and use that, and do it in an intelligent way, I think was good. And I heard that through, I think, everybody's. So that would be mine.
Thank you. Richard?
The thing that stood out for me is the massive storage that will come out from EVs. I just did another calculation. There is about, if the US goes totally electric, there will be about 3 hours worth of US production on wheels, which is almost enough to do optimal firm power with wind and solar.
Yeah, the one thing I'd say, I was surprised that Lyle had 15 applications tonight, so I didn't talk to him after this. No, but in all seriousness, I think Paul hit it. I think the common theme is there's so much going on, so much we need to accomplish, and we need to really, this grid modernization, I think really needs to take place. We need to think it all through. It's complex. There's theoretical things that we can do, and then there's the practical realities. That's sort of we need to know what's possible, and then we need to figure out the path to get there, right? So I think we've got a lot of discussions on things that are possible. I'm very interested in Richard's talk on that. And then what are the steps to get there in a sequential way that makes the most sense? So that's kind of things there.
Lyle?
Well, I'll bat the ball back at Ed. One of the things he said that I found very interesting was the fact that we used to do integrated resource planning to see how all the aspects need to come together to have a safe and reliable grid, and that we don't do it the same way anymore, which is incredibly ironic because now we're facing a situation where the complexity and the number of elements that have to come together to provide safe and reliable power are far more complex and many more aspects to it, and the complexity scares me all the time, especially as I think out the details of how to implement these things, and the amount of smarts and attention to detail that we're going to have to dig into, and yet we don't even have the kind of integrated resource planning that we had in a simpler past. So, like Paul, I get scared all the time about the enormity of this. Yep.
I'd say one of the things that was hit me was when Lyle said that we need to remove these the lack of I think he used the term disallow of enabling technologies, and that we are creating limits and that were established 20, 30 years ago before we had a lot of the things we have today, like the smart inverter controls or storage or curtailment options, and we need to account for those and in the policies and in some of the utility restrictions so that we can move forward. And the other thing is what Dennis showed, the graph with the bar chart showing that in California, that the utilities can justify the upgrades to their distribution, transmission, and generation to meet the electric vehicle load because, hey, they make money doing it. You know, they get twice the revenue, twice the value back in revenue of what they spent. And so if they could do it with EVs, we need to find ways of also getting that to, same thing to apply to support other grid modernization costs.
Dennis?
Great. In aggregate from everybody, a big thing that keeps coming home to me is I'm hearing facts. Every day, you know, working with electric vehicles, I hear every day they're going to crash the grid. And here I am with grid experts, and it's like, no, we can do it. You know, here's the use case here, here's the use case. We're smart. It is very complex, but as I showed, you know, in that graph from ARPANET and the development of these, you know, a lot of complexity, and this is an enabler, excuse me there. So the takeaway, it's really refreshing to hear these myths dispelled and, you know, and it's all stakeholders, it's the utility, the PUC, the scientists, to develop this value stack that dispels these myths.
Can I mention something that just now struck me? Was the fact that 4 out of the 6 speakers talking about what struck them mentioned electric vehicles. And I just wanted to say MCA's mini study on electric vehicle capability based on achieving the governor's executive order of 100% of new vehicle sales by 2035. When you do the math, that works out to about 180,000 megawatt hours of rolling battery capacity. And contrast that 180,000 with the Clean Energy Act, which said we're going to require by 2030 2,000 megawatts of stationary storage. Assuming that's at 3 hours, that's 6,000 megawatt hours. So the state's clean energy goal, 6,000 megawatt hours, capacity of electric vehicles, 180,000 megawatt hours. Shows how powerful that could be.
And what struck me along the lines of Dennis's point about dispelling myths is, having done a lot of work in offshore wind over the last few years, is the commonalities between offshore wind and solar and other renewable energies, particularly with respect to the challenges. So when it comes to talking with decision makers, or Lyle mentioned S2978, the renewable portfolio standards, all of these different industries are dealing with the grid challenges, interconnection, but also workforce development challenges, supply chain challenges, tax incentives, and so I think there's an opportunity here to work together towards a common goal. So I am going to dutifully get through. We got quite a lot of questions online in advance. I think the next one might be for Ed, because it says, for the utilities, how has the utilities' view of distributed generation changed over the last 5 to 10 years, and how do you expect it to change in the coming 5 to 10 years?
Well, we've been involved in, obviously integrating solar for 15 years now, right? So it's not that part. 5 years doesn't go far back enough, I guess. We've been doing it. We've been a big proponent of it. We've had our own program, So I think that's something that we've been involved in. I think the issue is looking forward is how big it's going to get. We've kind of highlighted all the things that are coming at us, and if we try to get to the goals that we're going to get to, we really got to step up our game. And how do we do that in a way that makes the most sense? So. So that's kind of the way I think about it. It's not so much looking back. I think we're pretty good, absent Lyle's November issue. But looking forward, it's more a challenge. I think that's really going to change. So if we're going to meet these 3 goals.
If I could just add, I had a very graphic slide of blasting through a brick wall and removing barriers, right? That was intended to be visceral. And that applies on the DER connection. I think PS and others have really stepped up to say, yeah, we have to remove those barriers. And, we can't violate the laws of physics, and we have to keep our business model, but they're working with us. But then in your comments, you also, which I thought was great, you said, we're also looking upstream to the transmission RTOs to say, we play a pivotal role breaking that barrier too. And if we do this right, we literally could, tighten the connection between wholesale, retail, and customer in a good collaborative way. So, yeah, I was very encouraged with that.
Yeah, and I think we've put out such a huge trove of information today, but one thing that stands out is that both Dr. Perez and Dr. Hegedus were presenting case studies that talked about how the amount of DERs that you could fit on the grid with these methodologies and technologies could easily be increased by 250%, and they both had the same number. So, that's a good indication of where we can get, hopefully in the short term in New Jersey.
That's great. I think the next one, Dennis just answered. Is there a standard yet for EV to get connected to the grid? Now, I believe that was 15118 if I was being a good student, but please elaborate.
15118 is plug and charge, which also dictates the communication with the grid, the bidirectional communication. And then Paul can talk about maybe 3068. SAE 30.
J3068. I forget which dash or slash, but that was just published. So that's a big step forward and a standard way to let the vehicle coordinate and communicate with the bidirectional power flow, whether it's just to the home or whether it's actually to the grid. But one thing I was saying, I think we were talking at the break, was when you look at standards are important because you really want as much as possibly plug and play, right? The early days of computer, if you wanted a computer, you had to understand how all that stuff worked, and then all of a sudden, you put this card in and you download software. But plug and play takes a lot of work and a lot of evolution. And you not only have SAE, which is the automotive standard industry, it's been operating for 120 years, but you have IEEE, which is the grid side, that's 100 plus years. And these two industries are just crashing together, but some of these common standards are emerging to let us do things with the assets, and get to as close to plug and play as possible.
And on the vehicle to grid, one example, it's not just injecting power that has its own scenario for being of value, but in California with the duck curve, imagine you have these fleets of EVs. Instead of curtailing that solar, it's like, hey, will you buy it at $0.01 a kilowatt hour? So the value of the EVs, as you get more solar, that value for leveling off that load. And also, PNNL developed a charge controller over a decade ago. It will do frequency regulation automatically while the car is charging. So there's a lot of other standards mixed in with that vehicle to grid bag.
Yeah, and I can't but emphasize the importance of standards enough. I like to use, when we talk about grid standards, I like to use the analogy as a former history professor of one of the reasons that the South lost the Civil War was also transportation related, because the North controlled the U.S. Congress and had funded standard railroad tracks. But in the South, it was private investors, and they either ran out of money and the track ran out, and the tracks were of different sizes, so they didn't connect. And this caused a lot of mobility problems. But a related question, how soon will we be able to get grid modernization in place realistically? Yeah.
Pass.
That's a long question.
If I had my magic wand and I was in charge, is that a precondition? So, no, seriously, many of you have been very patient. As I said, many of you were in our stakeholder meetings and contributed. We went through a round of having a straw rules for the near-term part, which many of you commented on. We got good input from the utilities. we had to go through and vet all those and really kind of understand logic, and there was a lot of work behind that. It took longer than I thought. But the version that came out of it maintains that collaborative thing. Okay, I think everybody's okay with this. We're going to keep this. We're going to deprecate that to the working group. So that set of rules is literally right now it has to be board approved, so it's in the cycle of the board, review. And then when that goes through the publication, a lot of you are familiar with, I think you mentioned the whole rules process. It's very rigorous, very deliberate, and plenty of more opportunity for comment and weighing in on that before they're actually, in the register. But we're right at the edge of getting into that formal process. So in terms of the longer term one, the working groups that we've had, we're working with Guidehouse, as our consultant, they published the original report, and then they stayed on to help us with designing this grid mod forum. And that took a little more than I thought, just because, as I mentioned, there's an NDA piece, there's a participation agreement, there was all these process elements to do this right, because it is something different. We're having working groups, unlike Delaware, maybe, we can talk a little bit more about how Delaware has done it. We're doing the same thing, working groups, but they're very focused around the specific recommendation, or those longer term ones that Guidehouse gave us. So those working groups are going to, we're really trying to facilitate a very productive engagement. We're going to have the best and brightest minds from the utilities, from the private industry that are there with the idea of developing the more difficult ones that touch on a lot of different aspects, but still need to be fully debated, and logic and modeling, and as I mentioned, piloting where we can. That's kind of how we're going about it. And I don't know if on the Delaware side, there's similarities, but I guess that was more of a governor's task force orientation. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're doing it a little different because we're in New Jersey, but I think it's going to be very productive. And by the way, we also have a lot of help from DOE. We've got technical assistance from them. We're starting to talk with EPRI in that regard, and of course all the experts that are at the EDCs are involved. So I could just say, hang in there. We're getting there soon. And, that's as specific as I could be.
It's great, hang in there.
Sorry for that waffling.
And I wish Joey and Celia from the New Jersey Senate Environment and Energy Committee were still in the room for this question. But just a quick summary, probably from Steve and Dennis and some others on best practices from different states as far as funding is concerned. How would you advise policy decision makers at the state level to fund grid modernization?
A small state like Delaware is going to have more of a challenge with that. And so I really think that state, can fund some demonstration projects or pilot projects in partnership with, let's say, a utility or PJM or with some DOE funding. I mean, we all know that in the last, 2 years, there's been a substantial outpouring of support from Department of Energy for various kinds of, grid modernization and utility scale demonstration projects. But the sorts of things I think that legislatures could do, or public service commissions, are to also create the environment that rewards those kinds of things. Like I mentioned, the public service or public advocate's office, they're sort of, in some ways, their hands are tied in Delaware as far as what that they almost have to oppose things if they're going to increase rates without increasing reliability, let's say. So it needs to be looked at sort of holistically.
So the question was how to source the grants, the funding available specifically?
Yeah,
for
some best
grid
practices
modernization.
for states to figure out funding for grid modernization. modernization.
So I could narrow it down to EVs in the grid.
Sure.
So, as most of you probably know, each state put in a NEVI plan, which is for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Corridor. Paul, you may know how much New Jersey got. I think it was close to 100 million.
I don't,
So that's
Kathleen Lewis is our EV person, she would,
so that NEVI program was on the Turnpike corridors 95, and that's beginning construction pretty soon. Every state filed, every state was awarded. Pennsylvania got 159 million. That's for DC fast charging, right? Which is a specific use case. To complement that, there's the CFI program, which is a community fueling infrastructure. That's competitive. The NEVI was a formula. If you hit the formula, you got your money. CFI was just announced from last year. 36 states were awarded money. Not as much as NEVI. I believe New Jersey got about 15 million. And Pennsylvania was not awarded anything. And there are many factors in that. Pennsylvania only has 40,000 EVs. We did get a lot of NEVI money, so that is a 5-year program. Year 2 of CFI, the application is due in April. The awards from last year indicated if there was a statewide application through a PUC or a Department of Energy or DEP, looks like the federal government favored them. In Pennsylvania, we put in 7 separate applications. I think for whatever reason, they didn't like that. But we're going to get a debrief from them in about 2 weeks, the Department of Energy. So, I shouldn't speculate on that. The other things, a state, each state has their own policy. California is leading. California incentivizes through the CAES, which stands for California Electric Fuel Standard, Emission Fuel Standard. California is its own animal. And as it seems like the island grids in California is almost like an island grid. And then, of course, in ERCOT, on a prior point, in terms of modernization, Tesla has a VPP where they aggregated all their Tesla Powerwalls. And they're saving each participant that about $150 a month on their utility bill. And then the last thing, what I don't like about the 4,000 grants that are available right now is they don't all systematize. Some of them are funding at the device level. The GRIP programs, Grid Resilience Infrastructure Projects 1, 2, and 3. The GRIP 1 money goes to utilities. I don't know if utility wants to speak about that. Grid 2 is for smart grid innovation, and GRIP 3 is innovative technology, which in Pennsylvania our DEP has just put in a concept paper for $250 million for that, and that's competitive as well. Some states are competing better than others on that.
Great.
That just scratches the surface.
Yeah.
New Jersey has 3 that we put in for that. They were due on January 12th. So, and I think utilities have filed their own for the first category.
Yeah, so even though they're GRIP, they will, part of the goal is to integrate DER, so the GRIP, and that's why I wish there was more of systematizing, as I said in the one diagram, to reward projects where you have all the stakeholders. And there are some of them on innovative technology, but it'd be nice if there were more.
But speaking for New Jersey, beyond grants, there is the bulk investment in the grid overall, and a few grants here and there, as well as pilot projects, don't get us to the pace at which we have to change the whole grid. And so, and I've already said it in my slides, but the only way to do that, we believe, is to activate the utilities to make investments and be able to rate base those so that they make a profit off of it and stay healthy, and get the big job of getting the whole grid changed up underway. And I think that's the only way to do it. Plus, the utilities are the ones who can mobilize and do the work. They own the distribution system, they know how to work on the distribution system, and they have access to capital. So I think that's going to be the aim if we want to do the whole job, which apparently we're gonna finish and get to the 100% renewable finish line in 11 years, for God's sake. So how else are we going to get it done?
So now that we've talked about what states need to do to fund grid modernization, I see a lot of CEOs of private companies, CFOs in the audience. What do you suggest private companies can do to support the electrification program? That was a tough question.
Well, apparently everybody thinks the government needs to do it, and utilities.
I'd say that, and I've seen this in action, that getting involved at the state level can be impactful for the businesses. And, you know, if you have a sort of stakeholder forum sort of arrangement like we do in Delaware, and apparently you do also in New Jersey, I don't know about, you know, Pennsylvania, your voice carries some weight, being, you know, being a business, either, you know, manager, director of a company or something, and you know, so they listen when you say that something would really help your, you know, business to grow or help employ more people. I think that that's one thing that you could do to help move this along, get involved in, more at the policy level.
Well, I think I'm the only solar industry representative here, so I better answer the question from the point of view of the solar industry. And I do have very strong feelings about that, and in terms of what we can do to move grid modernization along. One thing is certainly to deploy the expertise that we have, because we're the guys on the ground actually doing solar, interconnecting it, solving problems. And of course, the utilities are solving problems along with us too, but you know, from an industry point of view, we're the ones on the ground doing it. But policy-wise, one thing I'm a big advocate for is for the solar industry to be flexible. And a big part of that, which I was just speaking on break with Andy Powers from PSE&G about, is that we're big believers, and I know Richard Perez is too, that we have to have healthy utilities to bring about a renewable future. Can't do it without them. And so nationwide, and I'm also involved through the Amicus Cooperative on nationwide topics like this, and engaged in the fight in California with net metering 3.0 and now several other states. And it's a shooting war between the solar industry and the utility industry. We've avoided that in New Jersey. We've been on opposite sides of the table on issues before. We've cooperated on programs and created programs together, especially with PSE&G. But what I think we need to do now is take an overall look at how do we design policy so that it's good for the utility companies' health and growth and good for the solar industry's health and growth. And we're actually formulating sort of a recipe of 4 different policy pathways that we think can do that. And we're looking to start to open that conversation with the utility companies and say there are ways that this can be better for your shareholders and better for us at the same time. And there are models for that. One of my favorites is the California SMART program, in which utilities got involved in the creation of that several years ago and advocated for one fairly simple change, but from a policy point of view, kind of hard to sell, but they did, and they wanted this and insisted upon it. And the result was much better for solar developers, especially commercial ones too. This is going to come up because the board has voted to open a proceeding on net metering reform. God knows what that means, but we've got some ideas that hopefully are those ideas that can help both of us. So what can the solar industry do is be flexible and think out of the box. Net metering is a sacred cow, and I get my head chopped off whenever I go on the national stage and say, you know, we need to look at more flexible ways to skin the cat. And we need to do it in cooperation with the utilities. And I get called all kinds of names for saying, for using that phrase. But I think that's what we need to do.
And I heard flexibility in Ed's presentation too, right?
I'm not in the industry, but
Yeah.
I see a big missing link, Johnny, is that the industry tries to tackle it through the trees, through the bottom, like let's increase the hosting capacity here, build a bigger thing here. I'm a big proponent of looking at it from the top, and I see a few holes everywhere. Here, for instance, in New Jersey, you're planning to build like 7.5 gigawatts of offshore wind. I've never seen an optimization study between offshore wind and on land PV. Doesn't exist. You're going to have to curtail that offshore wind just as you have to curtail the PV to get to 100%. At the end of the day, you have to meet the load 24 to 65. And the best way to do it is outside the box. So first we have to look at the box, like New Jersey. So like you cited the thing, we're going to be at 100% and you listed, but we're going to have a discussion with that, because if you don't want to do farm power, you're going to need a few more gigawatts of the stuff.
Very good point. Very good point. Yeah. And the point you just made about offshore wind getting curtailed, I'm sure Ørsted hadn't even thought of that before they gave up. But yeah, yikes.
One thing I would say, drawing on my past experience in private industry with, is, and also what I see now with DOE, one of the criteria that they're putting on for these GRIP program awards, they want to see collaboration, cross-industry, like solutions that integrate a lot of different elements, including the utilities. So that's a really strong thing. It's like, no one's an island, here's our solution, we boil the ocean. Well, bad example, but, you want to present, to the extent standards enable you to do, things that snap together as a solution layer and level. Like that is something that industry can do. Forgo a little bit of, their own self-destiny, but in the spirit of the greater good, that this is scalable and repeatable, and you can leverage standards as they're emerging. And I think that element of it is hard, but the outreach and stakeholder things like this are important to do that. You have to seed the cloud with some ideas. Hey, what if we, to your point, Rich, with the curtailing generation is an important thing to allow more generation to be built. You want that capacity. But there's this whole emerging side of intelligent load management, demand response, if you want to call it that could, in synergy with that, not just curtail, but hey, important thing. Your example of the when's your charging window, that PJM thing was like, there, move it to the valley. That's one example of moving things around. When we evolved to the point of producing hydrogen, electrolysis as surplus electric, who knows, game on, with that in terms of just smoothing the whole thing, load and generation. But all the point being that all of these, I think, need collaboration and joint ventures, whatever the business method is, to get that working together. That's the holistic level of solution. Those are going to take the field. They'll have that advantage to win the field. So.
Great. So I heard Lyle earlier mention health, and just to switch tacks for a minute, because we got this question twice, and there's some environmental and energy justice leaders in the room. How do we best ensure that equity provisions, such as environmental justice-informed capacity mapping, are infused throughout New Jersey's approach to grid modernization?
Let's go first on that one.
Just before you start, that's another criteria on the GRIP proposals too. DOE is very, very strong on, making sure it's fair and equitable.
It's in the offshore wind solicitations
Yes,
as well.
in the offshore wind.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I have a personal view on environmental justice. I mean, that may be a little bit outside the box as well. But if you devise a 100% renewable, big picture supply of firm power electricity at the least possible cost for everybody, anybody that connects to the grid will have clean power, whether you live in neighborhood A or B or C. So for me, that problem is solved. It's like, do you want to attack that problem through the branches and the roots and the trees, or do you want first to look at the big thing at the top and then say, oh, that's the way you should cut the branches? So I tend to be a little bit aloft, but I see a lot of going on at the bottom that maybe we not have the full view either.
So essentially it should be in the roots of the system. That's great. Anyone else want to comment on that question?
So I'd say on transportation, so the CFI grant, which I mentioned, the community charging infrastructure, 40% of the funds need to go to EJ communities, which currently don't have EVs, so the thought process is how are we going to benefit by this? And some brainstorming on it. So Chester, PA, environmental justice community, you have people who are unemployed, need to go out to job training and services. There are now companies that have shared electric vehicle fleets. So one, they're hiring people, so it could create jobs in that environmental justice community. Two, you can say these people who are doing Lyft or Uber, they dedicate 50% of their rides to these environmental justice people to go to healthcare, to go to school, to go to training, to go food shopping, right? And these fleets that are in a hub, that hub could also be a community solar hub, where you maybe have 10 megawatts of solar, and Chester's perfect because it's right off I-95. So there's a lot of a team of teams who are working on putting together those type of proposals that could help these environmental justice communities. And the other corollary is it's going to reduce emissions, right? Because if it's in a corridor, cutting down, increasing the amount of EVs in that neighborhood are going to cut those emissions for that community.
Yeah, it's not my area of expertise, but we do have, energy efficiency. We have an energy efficiency filing now, and that involves not only, energy efficiency activity in these areas, but also a hiring program and jobs program for those type of activities. So not something we've talked a lot about, but something that we're actively involved in, and as part of the program, part of the filing, we actually have a jobs creation program as part of that. So it's kind of two things at once, right? We give more efficiency to their homes and also create jobs. So that's one thing I would highlight and get more details, but that's.
Well, I would say the complexities that you've heard from all the speakers today of how to create this grid of the future are immense, and making that apply to EJ communities is no less complicated. So with everything we've been doing so far, and I hope we get to discuss it more, we've sort of been shooting in the dark, so to speak, and you need study of what you're doing so that you're not shooting in the dark, you're targeted. And I think that applies to EJ as well. We've got to study the matter more thoroughly and think about how we're doing it, and make sure that there are no unintended consequences. But, studying it partly is studying how distributed solar affects health and affects the environment, not just for climate change, but also locally. And one, for instance, is that I think is not well understood yet, is when we inject a whole lot of solar in a particular neighborhood that affects a particular trading node on the PJM grid, and those trading nodes are where what is called locational marginal pricing, or LMP, is determined. So when you're feeding a node, Richard and Clean Power Research did the study for us in 2012 that showed that the pricing on those nodes goes down dramatically when you feed a lot of solar into them, because solar is fed in at the very times when the prices are the highest and helps reduce those prices. Well known, many, many studies have said this as well. When you reduce the prices locally, let's say on a node in Newark, which is the most important EJ community in the state, you're reducing the economies for fossil fuels to operate in that grid because you're affecting price. That affects, how often they're going to run, and then that's going to give us an environmental benefit. Now, the BPU has already recognized this in their calculation of the cost cap for renewables. They have a element of that cost cap calculation that is an environmental benefit that is brought on by solar. But we need to study that more exactly. How does that happen, and to what extent does it happen? It's a little controversial. And so we want to understand the health effects. The same thing with microgrids. How can those be deployed so that they differentially benefit the EJ communities with resilient power? Because the needs are so great in those EJ communities during power outages, and they're likely to be more vulnerable to those as well. So there's a lot of that stuff that we really need to study and figure out. And in terms of unintended consequences, one example is community solar. Now, my company does a lot of business in community solar. We love it. It's a great program. But we have to be mindful as well that we give a great big benefit to low-income subscribers, about 50%. One thing is we want to go from 50% to 100%. So how do we focus more than 50% on low-income people? But also, right now we're trending toward a 30% discount for those low-income subscribers, which is great. But if all goes well in the past couple rounds in the next few years, we'll reach in several years maybe 10% of the low-income population if we get to 100% low income instead of 50%. But that leaves 90% that are actually paying more so that that 10% can get a great big discount. So how do we even that out, right? So that all are benefiting, and we don't have to wait till 2050 to the point where most of them, that the low-income people are benefiting. So that's a wrinkle that I don't have the answer to, but I think we need to figure that out and maybe have other things in parallel with community solar the way it's currently designed that can reach the bulk of the low-income community.
Yep. I didn't mention, so on the GRIP programs, again, which is the Grid Resiliency Infrastructure, 1, to the utilities, 2, on the Smart Grid, 3, Innovative Business Plan. There's a community benefits plan, which is a big part of the scoring, specifically how do you benefit the environmental justice community. And in that plan, in Pennsylvania, we're working with the DEP. How do we target the leaders in these communities, environmental justice communities? So the people who are present in the room, you should follow up whatever state you're from. Did New Jersey get a GRIP 1, a GRIP 2, GRIP 3? Because part of the utility process is to engage those local community leaders and have the community say, hey, this school, we would really like to add resilience, because this could be not just protection for the children when the grid goes down, it could be a community cooling center, et cetera, et cetera. And also, I know IBEW was here. A lot of the grid plans have in there an apprenticeship training program and also curriculum development for the community college to train EJ communities.
Those are great ideas. So we have a number of other questions that were submitted in advance, but we'll ask one last question, and then we'll turn it to audience questions. If there's one thing that you would like policymakers to be aware of in the near term, what is it? Who wants to start? Sure, Dennis.
So I'll focus on the EVs. You know, even at the policy level, I've been at some forums like this, not so much policy, but sometimes politicians who will just say things that are totally mythical. So the one wish would be is to bring in the stakeholders and the experts and develop that use case and identify the low-hanging fruit where things are possible today and benefits can be manifested today.
That's great. Stephen.
In the way in which I've seen state legislators think about the grid and renewable energy is like usually maybe that much, and so getting them to think about it more and having more visibility, I think, is a good thing. And so, yeah, I would find ways of encouraging them to attend more forums. They're time's limited. They've got a lot of constituent meetings that they go to, but trying to get their attention with legislation or policy things that they see that they start to hear about from their constituents is really the way to go. Like when I've talked to had public forums and a legislator came up. They'd say, well, I don't know anything about this, but I've been getting phone calls about either some change in policy or some new solar project, or can you tell me what community solar is, or that sort of thing. So it bubbles up to them from their constituents. So I think really the way to get to communicate to the legislators is to get information out to their constituents and get them interested, and having them then have it bubble up to them, because that's how the legislators sort of set their priorities.
So it's important for all of us to serve as resources.
Mm-hmm.
I know Richard wanted to answer the question. Did you want to go next? Or?
Sure, I didn't mean to jump out of the
Go ahead.
But if I had something to say to the policymakers, it's a look at the end game, see how good it can be. It's a little bit outside the box, so you have to find out exactly how it will be and develop a plan so we get there. So we are not going to bump right and left along the way, back and forth. So the end game, I know, looks pretty good just about everywhere in the world. There is not one place in the world, yes, maybe Switzerland will go for it first, where they say, that looks really good, we're going to make it happen. So that's what I'd like to see.
Lyle.
Okay. We not only jumped ahead of me, but you also took my topic. but I'll say it anyway. We have already spent close, I would say, to $20 billion developing solar in New Jersey. In terms of total investment, a lot of that federal, state, and private. We're just awarded $1.1 billion just for the first phase of onshore infrastructure development, right at the point of interconnection, just in one locale for offshore wind, and about to do another RFP that might be a similar amount. And we're talking about grid modernization, which eventually, let's face it, that's going to be billions over time to make the grid ready to do all of this. So we're taking these billion-dollar shots in a dark room, as I said. And so we really need a techno-economic optimization study of the type that Richard was presenting, so that we can shed some light in the room and say, where are we going? I mean, this is, the term tech neutral is popular, but what you heard from Richard is anything but tech neutral. It's tech savvy, it's tech specific. It's like a recipe for baking a cake. And, you don't just pour in some of this ingredient and some of that ingredient. You have to know which ingredients you need and how much of each. And that's what that kind of study does. So how much wind should it be versus how much solar versus how much nuclear? Really, in reality, those are going to be the three elements of our grid in 2035. How much of each do you really need? And how much do you need? Like, we haven't even thought of overbuilding and curtailment, but how much of that do you need? You don't know. So the moves we're making now are blind. we have to right away, I mean, this is urgent. We really have to do that kind of optimization study so we can shed some light, figure out where we're actually going.
Ed, did you want to weigh in?
No, now they're both talking to my guy. No, absolutely no, but that's 100% right. Like, we need to be away from single entity like legislation versus what's the end game? You know, begin with the end in mind, and then what's the most efficient way to get there? There'll be some trade-offs, and there'll be some, but like, and maybe there won't be multiple paths. It might be a couple different ways to do it. So what are those couple different ways, and then drive policy and whatnot down those paths, so we kind of have a roadmap versus sort of a single entity, fire and go. So I'm just echoing what they said, just in a little different way.
Well, it's decided then.
Hear from me.
Here.
All right, I would say that I think New Jersey is in a pretty good place compared to many other states. Whether that's because Thomas Edison was here or whatever, but it's like we have some good creative thinkers, we have some tough problems, but I do think that from a policy standpoint, to the extent we can mandate, legislate, flexibility. We're already doing it on efficiency, but flexibility is that sort of final frontier. And it is my personal view, but it's reflected in a lot of the collaborations we've had in stakeholder input, is to the extent that flexibility can be rewarded through compensation. I think I forget who said the value stack. We talked about the value stack. Was that your? That was
A couple of us.
Yeah, a couple, right. So the idea is, let's not prevent multiple elements of value. Let's really encourage that. Let's flow benefits to that and open up the opportunity for the private investment on the edge of the grid in collaboration with a grid that can handle that, be rewarding the most flexibility. So I'm hoping that, and that's why I'll reiterate that I think demand response, intelligent load management, efficiency is permanent load reduction. Demand response is temporary and intelligent load reduction in response to, and it provides a tremendous amount of flexibility, both for, services, things like that, vehicle to grid, energy storage. Let's use all of the above, and I think it's not technology neutral, it's technology agnostic is the right? So let's not favor any one technology, but let's let the market bring the technologies that are safe and don't impact the grid reliability, first and foremost, that are understandable and useful, that the general population can engage in and participate. I started mine with participative grid. So all of those kind of philosophies, I think we have an opportunity coming together with our next iteration of the Energy Master Plan, which is the codification of that, which does a great job, which that's one of the reasons I say New Jersey is far ahead, because we've done that for better or worse, and we're about to redo it. And it's a great input opportunity for all the future Thomas Edisons to just get to the table, have a good conversation, and then let's lock it down into policy with this Energy Master Plan. So
He was a customer.
that's right.
I think it's labs right here in West Orange, Medicine, New Jersey, right? You've got to start here. So good collaborative thinking, and so with that, we turn to the good collaborative thinkers in the audience. Do we have any questions from the audience for the panel? Sure, go ahead.
Yes, my name is John Forgash. I'm with Soul Harvest Energy.
John, there's a microphone.
John Forgash, Soul Harvest Energy. Sorry if I'm a little late to the game here, but I guess you mentioned one of the things about what everybody learned from each other, and I think what's kind of struck me, I think a few of the panelists mentioned, was the rate basing of distribution network upgrades. And I guess my question just for Ed, in terms of, from a utilities perspective, is is the utility also on the same page as the developers or the industry in terms of, you know, really fighting for policy that would allow, you know, distribution network upgrades to be rate-based for future solar projects? I mean, I think as we heard today, it sounds like that's happening for EVs, that's happening for offshore wind. At least from my understanding, I don't think that's ever happened for solar. And just wondering if there's that collaboration there currently and a unified front in terms of, you know, wanting to get that done and wanting to see that happen from the utilities perspective. And I guess if so, why not?
Thank you.
I hate to lobby for a policy with the be right here. But anyway, no, but I think just, I mean, fundamentally, if we know that interconnection costs can have an impact on our ability to connect solar, there's no question about it. If those are, you know, are put in the rate base, you know, you'll get more projects done. That's a given, but we have to balance that. That's going against, obviously, the other customers as well. So if it's about how we define those goals. If the goals are to do it, that's absolutely one way to think about it and do it. I think there's no question about that. But I think I mentioned in my remarks, and it is one item that we should be considering at least as part of an overall, you know, look at regulatory items. So.
I can say, you know, I blew through our work group slide very quickly, but you can see it, you can get it online. But the one we're starting with is the integrated DER plan, which is going to address a lot of that. Hey, if there's a lot of pent-up demand on this, let's do this one differently maybe than one that might be more speculative. So that's the gist of like how do we build hosting capacity but intelligently. But there's another one which was a recommendation from the Guidehouse report that New Jersey BPU should define a mechanism to establish numerical cost and capacity thresholds above which grid modernization costs could be spread over a broader set of beneficiaries. So that is the focus of exactly that question. It's like, let's get the work group together, and the task at hand is, what's the criteria? Where does it make sense? Where are we just, you know, like, we're stupid not to socialize this because look at the benefits. It's going to have a lot of cost-benefit modeling, financial modeling. We're going to have some experts, you know, economics experts involved in that. And that is the focus of that work. Unfortunately, that's going to be later. It's coming, not too much later, but that's not one of the initial launch ones. But we definitely recognize. And I think I said in my remarks that the PJM, they're already doing that. They're already looking at ways that how do you socialize transmission interconnection costs that have benefit to a lot of people that are waiting to clear up their, you know, backlog queue. So.
So all that was streamlined up front for EVs and offshore wind?
Yeah.
Up front?
Yeah.
We have to kind of wait till the end.
Fair point.
We complain about that a lot.
So if you have any other questions, please feel free to queue at the microphone. And in the meantime, I'll reassure Ed that he is completely above board, at least here in New Jersey. I'm sure the conference could stretch for 20 hours. However, he has not reached his 20-hour threshold in which he needs to register with the Election Law Enforcement Commission for being a government affairs agent. We have someone at the podium. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Bill Hammond, M&E Engineers and U.S. Green Building Council. This was fantastic. I have to say, this is a lot of information today that was just great. I really appreciate it. I took so many notes I could keep you here with for way more than 20 hours with questions. But one in particular, I think I'll direct to Dr. Perez. When you say the least cost model is to overbuild and throw away, the word throw away just strikes a nerve. And New Jersey, well, we just have gotten funding to do a hydrogen hub in Philadelphia. And doesn't it just make sense to use that throwaway energy to produce hydrogen for those needs that we can't electrify? And does that not change the economics of it dramatically?
Oh,
It seems like it should.
yeah, but two parts to that answer. The first part is, does it make sense economically? So if you can do hydrogen with the excess,
it tells you that somewhere out there is a cheaper storage than the one that led you to the sweet spot, which like you're already sweet spots with the cheaper storage you could find. So the solution is overbuild, curtail. We call it implicit storage because the excess solar is a catalyst to storage, so you don't throw away the catalyst, it helps the system work. So I agree with that. The second part, which is much more open, is that when you curtail, there is free power available anywhere on the grid for inventive people to come up with smart solutions. And I don't discount that. But for me, I calculate the cheapest way to get a firm kilowatt hour, day and night, 365 days a year, involves throwing away some of the solar. And if you think about it, there's tons of solar. We're throwing it away all the time. The parking lot in the sun, you throw away 100% all the time. Yeah. So we're talking 20, 25%. I've not done the study for New Jersey with offshore wind and everything, but I'd love to do that study.
Well, I sure hope you will soon, because I think we're in desperate need of it. But I'd like to answer your question, Bill, from the point of view of an engineer and a businessman, with a little more specifics. If the curtailment is happening not every day, and when it does happen, it's maybe 3 hours during the day. So hydrogen plants are incredibly expensive, and if they're only operating for 3 hours a day and not every day, it's very hard to make them work economically. And that's on top of the fact that there's an enormous energy penalty when you get to hydrogen and transport it and store it and then reconstitute it into electricity again. The round-trip efficiency is incredibly low. And so Richard and I are both big fans of e-fuels. You heard that in his, so I think we're big fans of intentionally taking electricity, making that into hydrogen, and making that into liquid fuels you can transport and store. But to take his curtailment and turning it into hydrogen economically, it's a tough road.
If I may just, the only thing we found economical to use the curtail stuff so far, and we looked at a bunch of stuff, is Bitcoin mining. So you have a bunch of servers everywhere, and when the curtailment happens somewhere, because it's not at the same time, you mine the Bitcoin or whatever makes sense. So far, that's the only thing that I've found that makes economic sense today.
Great. Well, last but not least, Andy.
Okay, also a question for Dr. Perez. And I think the concept of curtailment is something we're taking very seriously. It's a little bit of a long-winded question. I apologize for that. A couple of points. One, I wonder how you think about the risk of changing weather patterns on this sort of approach, where you're relying on something that you've observed in the past, and it's overbuilding, relative to that. But what if the patterns change in the future? And then, second part of this, I'm wondering how much of the high cost of the e-fuels, because you were only using, I think, 5% of the time, is that a capacity utilization problem? And is there a different kind of local minimum that's pretty close that uses higher capacity of e-fuels?
I'm going to answer the last part first. In fact, we're building into the model now the optimum amount of e-fuels. Before that, we did 0, 5, 10%. I only. It depends where you are for the minimum. It may be around 7 or 5%, depending on the climate you have. But also, you have changing weather pattern, and that's where the e-fuel protects you almost forever. And that's flexibility, but unlike demand-side flexibility, we're talking supply-side flexibility with the e-fuel, because you build the capacity. So if 1 year you're going to get 20 days without sun, like it's way out of the norm because of climate change, you build the e-fuel anyway. So instead of using 5% that year, you may go to 10%, but it's not going to kill your system. So that little bit of supply-side flexibility is key to the big picture.
one thing I would say, it's not, I mean, I could just weigh in a little bit, again, going back to the Department of Energy, and in the transmission side, they're promoting this idea of grid-enhancing technologies. Anybody heard of the GET? It's a series of things you can do that don't involve conductors and wires necessarily, but things like dynamic line rating, which uses intelligent weather real-time analytics to feed in and say, hey, you know what? I know we sized your solar for this. And it's the point I think you made about if you add a battery, now it's sized to this. So you're really, instead, if you can, in dynamic way, reflect that my capacity is always changing on this line. So as long as you can export limit your power or your battery, we'll let you overbuild it, your solar, because we know you're going to be putting an induction stove, an EV charger, etc. Now you can have more capacity on the rooftop, knowing that you're limiting and curtailing when you need to, but you're also on the grid itself using maybe AI, maybe some predictive modeling on weather about dynamic load rating. Or if you have power flow switching capability, like in the telecom world, we could do that. But the more you have that flexibility to just reroute, you can let people build more, and you can let people put storage, and you can let people connect your vehicle to grid. As long as when we tell you curtail, in those 3 hours a day, you're doing it. That's how maybe by like a kind of a synergistic system that rewards grid flexibility. So that was my last comment.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question? Okay, well, I think we are out of time. So what a great panel discussion this was. Thank you for your attention. I'll let Marianne or Lyle close out the conference.
Yeah, well, first I just want to say how grateful I am to these speakers. I mean, what an incredible group of speakers, and the cross-fertilization potential here is amazing. And very grateful to Ed, because it was a last-minute shuffle, and so he did this with not a whole lot of notice. Grateful for that. And to Paul, just grateful that you're there at the BPU. It's the fact that we're in this place where we can imagine these great and unprecedented things, I think is a lot due to you. And Richard, certainly a superstar internationally, and traveled a long way to get here, as did Stephen, I think Dennis as well. So just really grateful for all these people for being here.